I mean the word rehab here in the same way that it might be used about drugs or alcohol rehab. This is spiritual rehab. For those people who are addicted to all things spiritual and have been very disappointed by it, well, of course they'll be disappointed by it because the spiritual people, the charlatans and people who sell all things spiritual, only sell abstractions. More about that in a moment. Anyway, I've said many times I don't really understand what is meant by the word spiritual. Somebody enlightened me and said, well, it's our possibilities. Well, why not just say possibilities then? Why use a word that actually doesn't mean anything? So I think in the general marketplace for these things, and this is a big marketplace, the marketplace for spiritual practices and for ways to enlightenment and all that nonsense, that's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There were two people in Sweden, I think it was, who wrote a book about pessimism and how good pessimism was. And they got letters from people in the self-help industry, which is slightly different, but saying, don't publish this book, you will be destroying a multi-billion-dollar industry. Don't think the spiritual industry is any different. I know, and I've known people who've spent decades in India. They found nothing. I've known people who've been in the Gurdjieff work for decades. They achieved nothing. In fact, even the people who hung around Gurdjieff, some of the more notable ones, so for example Bennett, Uspensky, a few people that are less well known, but Benoit, Tom Berg, all said the same thing. Gurdjieff's methods were brutal and didn't achieve anything. And in fact, I knew someone who knew Gurdjieff who said the same thing. Anyway, spiritual is really a term for other than what is. Well, what is? Well, what is you get a shower in the morning, you have breakfast, you go to work, you have friends, blah, blah, blah. All that is the what is. Spiritual is other than what is. In fact, spiritual is really just a collection of abstractions, non-duality, enlightenment, awakening, nirvana, salvation, whatever term you want to use. Non-attachment, just a whole pile of abstractions that don't really mean a great deal, but they are other than what is, and so they have a certain attraction to them. Because if somebody was to just try and sell you, well, here's how you become more engaged with what is, that wouldn't be very attractive, would it? But if they start talking about non-duality and other states of consciousness and all the rest of it, well, yeah, that's rather more attractive. And why are people attracted to all that? Because they're unhappy. The what is isn't attractive to them because they think they're familiar with what is, and it hasn't made them happy. So really, spiritual seeking, which is an addiction, by the way, just like alcoholism or drug use, spiritual addiction is driven by discontent with what is. Just like any other addiction, drugs and alcohol and so on. It's a form of pleasure seeking because clearly people wouldn't engage in spiritual pursuits unless they believed that it led to a greater state of pleasure. They're not going to do something that leads to a greater state of pain, are they? And so the reasons why people pursue this totally imaginary, fabricated thing called spirituality is because they're unhappy, because they want a greater state of pleasure. And because there's a whole industry that creates, well, in my opinion, not very convincing arguments, but they must have some level of power, because people buy into the promises made by the charlatans and the people who push all this spiritual stuff. It may sound as though I'm saying that, how can I put it, that the world is a dull place. What is dull. That's not the case. But I'll maybe treat that a little bit later in a moment. I don't want this to be too long. So, have you got that? Spiritual is just a word for other than what is. Because what is not of great interest to many people. What is what is causing them pain anyway. Their parents, their partner, their crappy flat, their inability to earn a decent amount of money, whatever it is. And even if they've got all those things, they'll still be discontent. So the word spiritual offers something other than what they have, which of course is going to be attractive. So, spiritual rehab. What do you need to do? Well, as with any kind of rehab, you need to deal with your life as it is, if you dare. This requires courage, just like any rehab requires courage. It requires an understanding of the fact that you have an addiction, first of all, and many spiritual people won't admit to that because they believe that being spiritual is some kind of virtue signaling. I'm a spiritual, kind, loving person. It's a virtue signal. I do my gratitudes in the morning. It's a virtue signal. So, you have to realize that you are addicted in the first place. So if you're a spiritual person, you can either continue with your spiritual nonsense, which, believe me, and I've met many people like this, you may grow old and become very bitter about all the nonsense that you've believed in. So you have to admit that you have an addiction, or you continue with what is essentially a whole lot of hocus pocus that will lead you nowhere. So you have to deal with your life as it is, if you dare, if you have the courage to do that. That means you deal with real things, like your parents, your siblings, your societal conditioning. Your parents will have offloaded a whole pile of stuff onto you that maybe you're not aware of, but it will be in there causing you misery. You have to deal with that stuff. Look, there's no point going chasing non-duality or awakening or whatever if you got a whole supercharged super ego, which is the part of you that's always saying should and shouldn't. If that super ego is loaded with you should be more attractive, you should be more productive, you should be more polite, you should be more, whatever your parents loaded you with. If you've got all that going on in there, forget it. I can understand why people chase after things like non-duality. They don't have to deal with all the hard stuff, but believe me, you do have to deal with all the hard stuff. Your parents, your siblings, maybe you are the youngest of the siblings and you got ignored and now you crave attention all the time. You need to understand that. And societal conditioning, well, I could go on about that for half an hour, but basically society tells you how you should be, and this conditioning that society tries to heap upon you may well be a very bad fit and may not be making you the least bit happy. Now, there was a lady called Kathleen Spieth who she may be still alive actually, I'm not sure, who happened to know Gurdjieff, but she was also a psychoanalyst, and she said very wisely that you will never know freedom until you are free of family. That doesn't mean that you ignore your family or that you don't like them or whatever. It just means that your family does not have hooks into you. How many people are going to achieve that? Probably not very many, because the family is a little herd, it's a little protective unit. And so you and many people compromise their own inner state to try and comply with the needs of the family. Anyway, another 20 minutes that could be spent talking about that. But to get old and to have gained nothing from all this spiritual effort is a tragedy. You know, I've seen it in multiple so-called spiritual traditions. And in fact, there's a very good article in The Guardian last week about people who've dumped their Christianity because, to quote the article, these people just can't keep making it up. They can't keep inventing their conversation with some imaginary figure in their head. But this is what people do when they're unhappy, when they're seeking some greater kind of more meaningful state. Anyway, to summarize this whole thing, what do you need to do to rehab? As a spiritual person who's basically the same as a drug addict, who's basically the same as an alcoholic, what do you need to rehab? Well, first and foremost, you need to drop all your belief systems. That is hard. What we're talking about here is courage. You need to drop all the mumbo jumbo that you constantly ingest. And let me say that what I call mumbo jumbo is all the things you cannot validate for yourself. If you can validate something for yourself, then that's fine. But you need to drop all the unverifiable belief systems. You need to start resisting the easy promises. You know, for an alcoholic, it's seeing a billboard with a bottle of whiskey on it. For you, it's seeing some nitwit on YouTube talking about non-duality or awakening. You need to become your own project. You need to become passionate about yourself, not about some abstraction called non-duality or enlightenment or nirvana or salvation or whatever. You need to have the courage to see that you've been hijacked by life, by your parents, and above everything else, you need to have the courage to not know. The courage to allow a space within you that isn't full of nonsense. What is the meaning of all this thing called existence? Well, I could do a 20-minute podcast on that. But the meaning of it, the answer to that question is, well, it's really, why do you want meaning? What is meaning? It's you striving for significance. What if you have no significance? I told you that this requires courage. But on the other side of all of this is one thing, and that is freedom. Inner freedom. The only freedom that matters is freedom from yourself. You know, people will post silly things like freedom or death or things like that, to be free or to die. The only freedom that matters isn't freedom in the form of taking off on a Harley Davidson and with some kind of camping equipment on your back and just camping out. That isn't freedom. The only freedom that's worth getting is freedom from yourself. You are your own problem and your own source of misery, and you have to deal with it. This is spiritual rehab. And finally, what I will say is that just as with real rehab, namely alcohol and drugs, you have to go through hell. You have to go through hell to reach heaven. It's just the way that it works.